slide, please. Thank you for joining us today again in this case study webinar. Symmetry's Scott Gulick, Vice President of Security, is teaming up with Mike Ayers of Powell Electronics to showcase the many ways their organization is using control panel GRC's compliance automation tools to maximize their resources. So without further delay, I'd like to hand it over to Mike Ayers to go ahead and get started. So Mike, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning. Today we're going to look at Symmetry's control panel GRC product. And one of the things that Powell we're a small company. We have a small IT department. So security is just one of the many things that I do. And we're going to talk about how that works for us, the tools that we're using to look at segregation of duties and sensitive transactions and so forth. Segregation of duties in a small company may be an oxymoron, but it really doesn't mean that we can ignore it. Okay. Powell's we're a wholesale electronics distributor. We're located about 10 miles south of the Philadelphia airport on the New Jersey side. We're family owned. Our global headquarters is here in South Jersey. And we've got branches around the country and also in Europe and China. We're on SAP Business Suite 7, and you see pictures of some of the places that our products are used. Scott?
Great. And then this is Scott Gulick speaking, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on SimSoft. SimSoft is a sister company of the Milwaukee-based Symmetry Corporation. Symmetry, of course, has a number of years in the technical implementation solutions marketplace. And as Heather said, I lead the security practice for Symmetry Corporation, as well as leading the direction and architecture of the control panel suite. Before we were a actual builder of GRC software, we did a lot of implementations on some of the first generation software solutions, which gave us a lot of feedback as to what people would like to see when they're looking at governance, risk, and compliance software. And that's a lot of what you'll see that we've built into our solution. So enough about us. We'll kind of get into a little bit about the compliance reporting. From a layout perspective, the way we're going to be working through this today is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on some of the things that you want to be doing from a security and controls perspective. So I'll be talking about some of the theories, and then Mike's going to be chiming in to tell you how they handle these particular items or address them at Powell, which, again, Powell's a relatively small company, and it makes it challenging when Mike has multiple hats to wear. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is a bit on periodic compliance reporting. So with periodic compliance reporting, this is when the auditors, whether it's external or internal, are coming to the security team or the IT team and asking for specific reports. They want to know who has access to selected transactions, who can import transports into the production system. So these requests are coming in, and what's funny is the requirements are often very vague. So it's not clear what they might be looking for, and that can lead to some inappropriate results. As an example, a lot of times the auditors will come back and say, show me who can run these transactions, but they're not including relevant authorization objects, which can lead to some false positives. Looking through the list of attendees, I know a lot of you on the line, and a lot of you are security folks that spend a lot of time in SUIM and run reports there. So if you know SUIM, you know how time-consuming it can be to extract reports of who can run specific transactions out of that. And, of course, there are a lot of different OSS or SAPnet notes that might be required to make sure SUIM provides you with the right data. So as an example of what one of these requests might be is a list of transactions that actually relate to vendor master maintenance. This is actually a list that we had gotten from one of our customers' auditors, and they were asking, well, who has access to transactions inside of this group? And, of course, they had 20 other similar lists. And when all you have is SUIM to go run those reports, that becomes very challenging. So in SUIM, you can say, you can search for kind of an either or, but you can't do this many types of transactions. And you might also have instances where, say, your IT support staff has access to some of these transactions, but if you don't have the underlying authorization objects, you might not be able to identify when those IT support staff really only have display-only access. Another thing is if you're a small organization, you might have instances where these transactions are assigned to someone because they're a backup. When my coworker's on vacation, I back them up, and therefore I have this ability to run the vendor master transactions. And from an audit perspective, you might want to try to prove to the auditors that these transactions are actually unused.
So Powell uses a lot of different features of the control panel. We're going to take a look. This is the kind of the dashboard menu launch pad here. And we're going to take a look at a couple of ones that Powell uses. So let's move on. And so questions, and again, Scott talked about the questions that come our way that may or may not be fully formed, and we can waste a lot of time. So we're in the middle of implementing, or we just finished implementing a warehouse management. And we needed to know who was using the inventory adjustment transactions under inventory management and why. So this report shows me who has the authorization and also whether or not they've used the inventory adjustment transaction. So you can see on the screen, you see the role that we're looking at. On the far right, you see last execution date. So you can see in some cases the role transactions were not used. They may have had the authorization, they never actually used it. And we look at the next slide, we can also see by the last execution date, again, we're looking at the right side here, we're seeing who's actually using this, who's actually using at least one transaction. So out of the 75 people that have that authorization, 34 of them have used one transaction, which means the rest of them have not. So in this case, we were looking at not only the role, but we're looking at who's using the MI10 transaction, which is the inventory transaction we were specifically concerned about. Okay.
Great. So that's one side of the periodic compliance reporting when we're looking at a transaction, a specific transaction or group of transactions. But another request that comes in would be our business has a need to put up basically a firewall between two different organizations. And this is actually something that had just come in from a customer last week where we have two companies in our production system. Company A cannot see data for Company B, and Company B cannot see data for Company A. So they had picked 4 different authorization fields that they cared about restricting on, which would be things like company code, plant, sales organization, and purchasing organization. So the challenge here is if you take a field like company code, there's almost 300 authorization objects that have the company code field. So as a security person, how do you make sure that you didn't accidentally give access to the company code field on one of those many authorization objects and thus kind of break down your firewall?
So for Powell, that was one of the phone calls that Scott got a while back. We have a small disadvantaged distributor, which we have an ownership stake, and we provide all the back office services to them, shipping, assembly, that kind of stuff. But on the sales side, we have to have a firewall between them and us. So we're using the risk analyzer to help us make sure that we don't inadvertently breach that firewall through an inappropriate role assignment, as Scott talked about. So we look at the next screen. I want to know whether JRH salespeople can see Powell Sales Organization. So I'm going to run, for example, an ad hoc analysis. This is something that I haven't coded this into to be an actual run because occasionally I want to look at this differently. So I'm looking at a user group to which all the JRH salespeople are assigned. And if we look at the next piece, I look at sales org. So I want to make sure that I want to see if they can see any sales org that starts with P or E. Those are 2 that they should not be able to see. And we go again to the next screen. No risk identified. That's very nice. And the next little mouse click shows me what did I look at. I looked at a total of 216 users, and I had total roles looked at, selected users, there's actually only 6 of them with 45 roles, and none of them have that risk. So that's, and again, I run that on the other side, looking at Powell sales organizations, looking back at JRH to make sure that they can't see it either. And that's how I'm using the ad hoc query tool. So in the next slide, again, segregation of duties. I wear many hats. I'm the functional support for Powell. Security is one of the things that I'm responsible for, but I don't really have to spend a lot of time on it. So in terms of segregation of duties, there are risks here. And we look at the next slide. We use the rule books that are provided by Control Panel to identify risks. Eventually, we may want to create our own, but the Control Panel rule books will work really well for us. Scott can explain this in more detail, but I think you can, this is a little bit of an eye chart perhaps, but you look at the ability to do things like create a fictitious customer and issue invoices. Obviously, we all don't want to make sure that doesn't happen. So Scott, you want to talk a little bit more about this?
So in this output is showing you kind of a high level of what particular risks you had found for selected users in your environment. So this is a subset of the delivered Control Panel rule book, and as Mike had pointed out, this is kind of the segregation of duties rule book. The way you'd read it is that you've got a risk that someone could, for example, maintain fictitious vendor and send payments. They have this because they are able to maintain vendor master data and maintain AP manual posting. So we use a conflicting function methodology as opposed to a conflicting transaction methodology to help report this.
Okay, and
so
go ahead.
From that, when you're trying to actually determine what people have been doing, that's where real-time transaction monitoring comes in. And that's how the auditors might see inconsistencies or issues with the way that you've allocated your transactions to users. So we talked about earlier how a user might be a backup for their coworkers. A department may be too small to properly segregate duties. And these could be real concerns. There might be a cleanup process required. But based on that segregation of duties analysis we were just looking at, the real-time transaction monitoring is your way to figure out what can we actually clean up. So the challenge here is, well, where did the transactions come from? So what roles provided the user with the access? And that can be a challenging report to run inside of SUIM. But the other question is, well, we've identified these transactions. Are the users really running these transactions? So, and you do have some opportunity to do reporting out of STO3N, but the output is pretty limited, and it can be difficult to pull that out. So when you start looking at this data, you ask yourself, well, can we take away this access? And the answer is maybe. So a lot of the smaller companies don't necessarily have the time or budget to re-engineer their SAP security just because their auditors don't like it. Instead, what they'd want to do is try to focus in on what things might be in their security model that don't really map to what someone's doing. So if you know what transactions people are using, you might find instances where the security doesn't really map to their job responsibilities. So if we're able to do a periodic review of our security model, we can look and see if there are instances where there are role assignments that are no longer required, or even transaction assignments specifically for transactions that our auditors care about that are no longer required. And what this does is it helps you make sure that your security model stays in line with the business requirements. And based on this feedback, you could do a small security project to do a little bit of re-architecture to get a little bit more in line with what the auditors are asking without having to do a full-blown security redesign.
So here's a case where I've got a situation, and you'll see that the RBE in parentheses, SAP used to have a reverse business engineer capability that allowed you to look at a lot of transactional detail with users. But with Control Panel, we can see all the roles that a user has and which ones are used or unused. And we can also, of course, drill into this by transaction as well, as Scott said. So in this example, this person has a number of roles they've never used. So I've got to ask the question, does this person have the proper roles for their job function? And this is something that we would go through and look at and say, well, I've got this person assigned to a purchasing role, but that person may actually not be in a purchasing role. So that's something I go talk to the department head about and said, this person has a lot of unused transactions. What are they doing, and do they have the right one? And maybe I need to come up with something that's a little bit more specific to this person's role.
So we talked about that we may not always be able to take access away, but what we can definitely do is monitor the access. So if we know that someone has too much capability, so maybe it's having conflicting transactions, or it's just having access to sensitive transactions that we're concerned about, we may not be able to really change the security model. So if it's a smaller company or it's a non-publicly traded company, there may not be the desire or ability to really go in and make those changes. But what we can do is monitor what they're doing. So if we can monitor their transaction executions, we can effectively mitigate that particular risk. So if, for example, a controller is notified when someone runs a transaction that opens or closes posting periods, we can reduce the amount of risk associated with someone having the capability to run those transactions. So this basically allows someone to run the transaction, but kind of ratchets up the logging on them a bit so that we can understand what they have done inside of it.
And I use sensitive tracking and reporting pretty often. I have a list of sensitive transactions that we've identified as things that we really want to know about. For example, my credit manager wants to see all changes to customer masters and customer credit masters. So we have all those transactions in our sensitive transaction file, and when they're executed, she gets an email that tells her what's happened. In the case of the example that I'm going to show you in a minute, we're looking at someone running an MR21, which is an inventory adjustment transaction. Our controller monitors all those adjustments. So this is adjustments to material evaluation. So user S. Jackson has executed a transaction to adjust material costs. In this email that comes to me, again, it's an hourly thing that runs that shows me what's been done. So if we look at the next little piece of this, the attachment shows me who did it, what they did, and in this case, the changes of what was the old value, what was the new value, specifically what materials were changed and what was it changed from and to. This is a report that comes, as I say, comes hourly, and so the same with the customer master detail. The credit manager just opens the attachment to it, looks at it, and determines that it was appropriate. One of the things that was interesting as we were tuning our security roles, this was very helpful because I'd see a transaction come through and go, wow, this person absolutely should never be running this transaction. And it allowed me to go in and fine-tune roles for user groups to make sure that I had all the appropriate transactions locked down. Okay. Another interesting thing that we use is some of the dashboard reporting on usage analyzer. So I look carefully at the top transactions that are being used, and also the folks that are using the system heaviest. I get some of this reporting through SAP's Early Watch on a monthly basis. But with the control panel, I can look at this any time and just make sure that I've got CPU. This one is measuring CPU time in seconds, so I can see the load on my system. I can see what's causing it. And the very top one I have is a Z. So I've got to ask, is this the most coded most efficiently? And this allows me to look at that. Now on the next screen, we're looking at that continuous controls for segregation of duties. Which, Scott, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So with continuous controls monitoring for segregation of duties, we're able to do some exception-based reporting to mitigate your segregation of duty risk. So Mike's been talking about sensitive transactions and how they monitor that, but that's really half the battle because, of course, the segregation of duty reports are going to be when someone's executing multiple parts of a business transaction. So we've talked about Risk Analyzer and how Risk Analyzer can show you risk and show you what could happen. And we talked about Usage Analyzer where we can do some monitoring to show what has happened at a transactional level. But the question that you really want to answer is, did someone in my purchasing department create a vendor and then receive goods in a PO for that particular vendor? Because the conflicting transactions, that's great information, but in reality, you want to make sure that people are executing incompatible portions of the same business transaction to really find that particular risk. So what we're seeing inside of Risk Analyzer here is how we can take a business transaction and look for conflicts in it. At the top, we can see that we have a purchase order that was changed yesterday, and we see who changed it. And then we can see that over the past 12 months or whatever period we specify, that the same user has actually changed the vendor master that is on that particular purchase order and changed the material master, and they've paid that vendor, and so forth. So this is showing you the actual risk from a segregation of duty perspective, not just the fact that they could have done it, but they did do it. These are the true exceptions that you want to be reviewing to make sure fraud wasn't occurring in your environment. This is showing you a view of what that might look like in procure to pay, similar concepts in order to cash. So we had a sales order yesterday and a customer payment was received yesterday. And we're showing a risk because previously that same user had released a delivery block on the sales order and changed the customer's credit limits and received the goods. So this is identifying the instances where one person has likely done too many pieces of the same business transaction and flagging risk. At an absolute minimum, these are the things you want to be reviewing in your environment to make sure something bad hasn't happened. The next process we wanted to chat about is user and role change management. So with user and role change management, of course, this is the area where the security folks spend their day-to-day resources. They're going through and processing user changes, deactivating users, or doing troubleshooting. So troubleshooting from a security administrator's perspective is quite time-consuming. A lot of times we get SU-53 information and a screenshot that says, I can't do this, but the requesters don't always know what the problem is, or they lack the communication to us as to what the issue is and how we recreate that problem. So you end up with an endless back and forth trying to provide access based on what SU-53 says, when in reality that doesn't always answer the question for us. You often will need to take that output from SU-53 and use SUIM to actually go through and identify where that authorization might exist. So part of that might be finding transactions or authorizations and roles, or understanding the roles that are currently assigned to the user so we know what we would want to fix.
So the troubleshooting at Powell, security troubleshooting at Powell, I call the control panels troubleshooting tools SU-53 on steroids. I used SU-53 when we first revamped all of our security roles, and it's interesting. So again, I've got all the information I need to recreate the issue and the authorization trace that I need. And on the next screen, you'll see that. Okay, so here's a user. You're not authorized to use VL33N. What's the next step that they do? At this point, they're executing the SimSoft SU-53. As opposed to the standard SAP SU-53. And the next thing they get is put in the transaction you're trying to do, and they've already captured the user ID. The next thing is that we see they can add the opportunity to put in any kind of text that they or notes to me that they think I need to know. And when they're done, that data is emailed to me automatically. So on the next screen, you'll see what I do, or what I get, rather. The old SU-53 gee, I'm not really a full-time security guy, so a lot of this is, wow, what is all that? And again, as Scott said, now I'm diving into SUIM to try to figure out what's going on. So rather than that, the security troubleshooter is sending me an email. And I get this in my email. Here's the user. Here's the transaction that they're trying to do. The message was, I can't access it. I get all their current role assignments, and then at the bottom it shows me the role that has that requested transaction. Our roles are sort of semi-intelligent in terms of their names, and if I can look at that and say, well, yeah, this person absolutely needs to have that authorization, I go to their user ID and add that role to them. Or I may look at the user's role-based user group and decide that everybody in that group should have that role. And I can also, of course, consult with the department head if I'm not really sure. If you look at the next screen, sometimes we have authorization issues. Now, we've got access to the transaction, but somewhere in the middle of that, we get an authorization block because of an object. Attached to the email that came to me, I have everything that was, anything that's, these are the authorization objects that were accessed, and their return codes. If I got a return code 12, I've got a problem. So I can look at that and I can decide, should this person have that authorization object? Is it appropriate, or are they trying to get somewhere they're not supposed to be able to get to? I can tell just by looking at this where they are and what that is. I could not really figure that out well with SU53. SAP standard SU53. So this attachment comes, and I can zero in on the offending role and make adjustments if I need to make it.
And of course, a lot of people that are on the call probably recognize this as being the authorization trace output. But as Mike said, with the security troubleshooter, this is kind of a self-service way of getting this data and seeing everything that passed or failed instead of just the last failed authorization.
Right. So there may have been somewhere else that was a problem. Okay, on the next slide, we'll talk about a little bit about user and role change management. Measuring.
And this is
go ahead.
This is getting into our licensing. So, of course, the licensing can be a problematic process. I think a number of customers are going through this right now. It tends to happen over the summer for most of our customers. And it's always going through that process to say, okay, how many seats do we have, and how many licenses do we actually need to be able to allocate? And boy, I remember last year we talked about professional and limited professional users, but what was the difference of those? Or better yet, how do we need to define the difference in our environment? So licensing is one of those things that if you classify people incorrectly, you might find that your SAP sales rep is knocking on your door and asking for additional dollars to buy these additional seats. So from this scenario, we want to try to come up with automated methods to classify our users. But also we have the scenarios where we might have users that really aren't using the system, and therefore they should really be terminated. So could we have an automated process that's going to terminate the users that haven't accessed the system within a given time period? Of course, by having that automatic termination, we'd be able to get the users out of the system and then they're not valid for licensing at all.
So, Houston, we have a problem here. This is an example of a look at a license check dashboard where I'm looking at my professional licenses, my limited professional licenses, and obviously I've got a mismatch here. Current license assignments, and then the yellow is what's suggested. I also see that I've got the opportunity to do more test licenses if I need to. So this is a really great little preview of what's going to happen when you start doing your license check. I do mine in January, so I'm good so far. But it's also gives you an opportunity well in advance to perhaps do a little bit of negotiation with SAP in terms of licenses. And as Scott said, you can also kind of define where we are also, and this is one example. I didn't list everything, but again, the users that are not accessing the system, we're pretty good at cleaning those up. But that's a really interesting snapshot of what is about ready to be sent to SAP if you start getting into your license check stuff. So again, return on investment for Powell. We don't really need a security consultant that we have to call on to help us with this. Everything is handled by our functional support guy, which is me. So when the CEO comes and says, I need to know what transactions this group of people is running and what they can see, he doesn't have to leave my desk and just show it to him. And giving him the answer right away is just he's got a lot more confidence that we're on top of what it is, and he's got can talk to his board about the fact that we've got a good handle on security. Board of directors again wants to know who can make customer master changes and how we know what was changed. Well, that's a report that the credit manager is getting on an hourly basis. And again, easy dashboard reporting for department managers who need access to this and want to keep tabs on what's going on in their particular group and the executive team. It's really been it's taken all the mystery out of security for us anyway. So, Scott, you want to talk about the best practices?
So yeah, just again, some of the things that we've gone through today, from a best practices perspective, you want to make sure you're doing your periodic reviews. They are certainly time-consuming, but as we've tried to show you, there are tools that can help with the automatic execution and distribution of these periodic reviews. And if you can get yourself out of the day-to-day report running, that's going to free you up for more of the value-add activities. There will be instances where you likely have to give someone conflicting transaction access, but that's where you can use the real-time transaction monitoring to be able to help you mitigate risk. If you know what people are doing and you know what people are doing inside of transactions, you've got a chance of mitigating or monitoring that risk to make sure bad things aren't happening. Those periodic security reviews that we're showing you are a good way to clean up some of that excessive access in the event that people have access to do things that's really not in line with their job responsibilities, and it kind of gets you on the right path there. And then, of course, as you go through your day-to-day workload and are getting requests from users, security troubleshooting is always a challenge. It's something that comes up at all companies, but having the tools to simplify the process really makes it easier, and makes it easier from both the security administrator's perspective and the user's perspective, because you don't have all the back and forth. And lastly, if you know what your users are doing in the system, it can help you save on licensing costs, because you're able to look at what they're doing from a usage perspective, or even figure out if you've got users that aren't actively using the system and get them knocked out of there so that you're not paying for them. So that's pretty much what we wanted to chat about today. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask them, and I'll turn it back to Heather.
Okay, thank you, Mike and Scott. Great job today. If any attendees have any questions for Scott or Mike, this is the time to type them into the question and answer section in your WebEx side panel. You can also send a message to us via chat, whichever you prefer. So if you have any at this time, go ahead and type those in. Just on a side note, we will be sending everyone the recording to this presentation. So if you would like to pass it along to other team members, feel free to do so. Or if you'd like to speak with us further about the tool, both mine and Scott's contact information is on the slide here for you to see. So, Scott, can you see the questions there in the Q&A
yes,
section?
I sure can.
Okay, there's one in, and then there's a few in the chat as well.
Okay. So, and I think, Mike, this first one's probably for you. And the question was, how can you describe the implementation process? How many systems, how many days did it take, and so forth? So I'll turn that to you, because I know I was involved really your environment.
Yeah, our environment, we have the traditional Dev QA prod system running this ECC6 system. And implementation is a series of transports that come in and a series of licenses that are applied to that. We tried this out pretty good in dev first, just watching how it would work and making sure there wasn't anything unexpected. Put the same thing into a QA environment, which is a pretty recent copy of production, to make sure everything would work great. And then we moved it up to production, and the terms of monitoring it, the control part of it is that, when I'm doing sensitive transactions and so forth, that's a transport that I control carefully to make sure that everything's running, that I'm not going to suddenly be overwhelmed with data. And it allows me to also change the email addresses to whom each sensitive transaction is sent. So it was pretty easy. In terms of how many days, Scott, I don't think it took us a week to get everything up and running.
No, I think we actually did this entire implementation remotely via webinars, not unlike this one, and I think we were probably less than 20 hours of webinars.
Yeah, we would do basically two-hour webinar sessions with the team that was learning about this. But we're also using the basically the job scheduler functionality as well that we haven't really touched on.
We had another question here asking if the reports that were shown were tailor-made or if they were standard out of control panel. And everything that you saw from a screenshot perspective was standard out of control panel.
Yeah, we've done really no customization of that at all. It's just we're using the standard reports. And we get periodic refreshes and updates, Scott. As you get requests and ideas and stuff from other people. There's a pretty good feedback mechanism here that if there's things that we see that we're not getting, chances are is liable to show up in the next little release of updates and enhancements.
One other question, and this is for Mike. The question is, can Mike quantify the values that Control Panel has brought to his organization and where he saw the greatest benefit?
Well, I inherited security, and the system that we had was pretty bad, and really no control over it, no real knowledge of what was going on. We had way too many people that had SAPL. And when we upgraded to ECC6, we took the opportunity to revamp our security, all of our security objects, and make them a little bit more sensible and very granular. So Control Panel for me was I didn't have Control Panel at the time that we did this, but we got it right after that. And I told the security guy that had done it, okay, here's your final exam, and we have done a lot of analysis and tuning of roles and adding and taking away transactions and so forth. So, again, I spend probably an hour a month now on security, whereas, again, I've got all the tools and I've got the early warning that comes to me in terms of my sensitive transactions, in terms of reports that I periodically run. I'll sit down and look at them and just go through and just see what I can find. If there's a specific question that comes in usually from the CEO, I can give him a report within a few minutes of everything that he's asked me for. I couldn't possibly have done that without this tool.
Okay, so I think that's it for our questions today. We'd like to thank everyone for participating, and we'd like to thank you again and tell you to have a good